The morning of the 7th day of June in 1944 dawned over the French countryside near Sainte-Mère-Église in the Normandy region, and there stood a soldier of the German Wehrmacht, an Obergefreiter by the name of Klaus Müller, who served with the 709th Infantry Division. He found himself witnessing something that would fundamentally challenge everything he understood about modern warfare. His eyes tracked the seemingly endless procession of American military transport rolling steadily inland from the beaches designated by the code name Utah. What struck him most profoundly was not simply the presence of enemy forces, but rather the extraordinary uniformity and quantity of what he observed. During a period spanning merely 120 minutes, he had maintained a careful count that reached 117 vehicles, and the remarkable aspect was that each of these reconnaissance cars appeared absolutely identical to the last, and furthermore, every single one looked as though it had just been manufactured, without a scratch or sign of wear visible on their olive-drab painted bodies. The spectacle that unfolded before Müller that morning transcended the conventional understanding of military invasion. This was something altogether different, something that revealed itself as a phenomenon rooted not in martial strategy alone, but in the raw power of industrial production scaled to dimensions previously unimaginable. The vehicles that the American forces referred to casually as jeeps had made the transatlantic journey in numbers that ran into the thousands upon thousands, and their sheer abundance conveyed a reality far more destructive to German hopes than any amount of explosive ordnance could deliver. The fundamental truth becoming apparent was that the forces of the Third Reich were not engaged in combat against merely another army composed of soldiers and weapons, but rather against an entire integrated system of industrial production that had successfully transformed the conduct of warfare into something resembling the mass manufacture of consumer goods. The arrival of these vehicles had commenced with the very first waves of the amphibious assault, with drivers steering them directly down the ramps of the landing ship tanks that had made the crossing of the English Channel in convoys whose magnitude seemed to have no end. Each individual LST possessed the capacity to transport as many as 30 of these jeeps in fully assembled condition, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of these specialized ships engaged in the continuous process of depositing their mechanical cargo onto the Norman shoreline. The vehicles bore the manufacturer markings that identified them as products of either the Willis Overland Motor Company, which operated its facilities in Toledo, Ohio, or alternatively the Ford Motor Company, whose production lines ran in Dearborn, Michigan. Their official military designation read as Truck 1/4 ton 4x4 Command Reconnaissance, but to the German soldiers who stood watching this motorized tide flowing onto French soil, these machines represented something far more threatening and significant than their technical specifications might suggest. They were tangible evidence of an industrial capacity that simply defied any framework of comprehension available to military minds trained in the European tradition. A German officer holding the rank of Hauptmann, whose name was Werner Lindemann, and who commanded the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment, composed an after-action report that bore the date of June 9, 1944. In this document he recorded observations that spoke to the profound bewilderment spreading through the German ranks. He wrote that the opposing force possessed motor vehicles in quantities that the Wehrmacht typically reserved for small arms ammunition rounds. Every unit of the American military structure, extending downward to the squad level, appeared to have access to motorized transportation. His company had succeeded in destroying 12 of the enemy reconnaissance cars during the previous day's fighting, yet when morning arrived he found himself counting 40 of these vehicles operating in the identical sector. The Americans, he noted, handled complex military vehicles with the same casual disregard that German forces showed toward rifle cartridges, treating them as consumable items to be utilized and then discarded without a second thought. Had the German military planning apparatus possessed access to the actual statistical data regarding American Jeep production, the figures would have struck them with the force of a physical blow. The period spanning from 1941 through 1945 saw American manufacturing facilities produce a total exceeding 640,000 of these vehicles. When production reached its peak efficiency, the combined assembly lines of Willis Overland and Ford were completing one finished vehicle every 90 seconds, which translated to 40 vehicles per hour, or nearly 1,000 vehicles per day. This single vehicle type represented fully 1/4 of the entire American military motor transport production output. The Germans, whose industrial system had managed to manufacture barely 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entirety of the war, found themselves psychologically and materially incapable of conceiving such numbers. The scale simply exceeded the boundaries of their experience and expectation. The element that enabled this production miracle to occur was a degree of standardization that surpassed anything that existed within German military experience or doctrine. Every Jeep that emerged from the assembly lines, regardless of whether Willis or Ford had built it, employed components that were completely and totally interchangeable with those of every other Jeep. A transmission assembly pulled from a destroyed Ford GPW model could be installed into a Willis MB model within a matter of minutes rather than hours or days. Wheels, engines, axles, and even the smallest components such as spark plugs and fan belts maintained identical specifications across all production runs and all manufacturing facilities. This standardization extended outward from the vehicles themselves into the supporting supply system, where spare parts were positioned in advance based on statistical analysis of component failure rates, thereby ensuring that replacement parts remained constantly available wherever they might be needed. A Feldwebel named Hans Richter, who served with the 716th Static Infantry Division and who had established a concealed observation position near Carentan, maintained a diary in which he recorded his observations of American operational methods. He wrote that the Americans did not engage in vehicle repair in any traditional sense. Instead, they simply replaced broken components with new ones drawn from what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply. He had personally observed a damaged vehicle being restored to full operational status in less than 60 minutes. The engine had not been repaired through careful mechanical work, but rather had been completely replaced, unbolted from its mountings and lifted free, with a fresh engine installed in its place with no more ceremony or difficulty than one might experience changing a tyre. German mechanics, he noted, would require a full week to perform such an operation, and even then would need access to specialized facilities. The Americans accomplished this feat in an open field, under sporadic artillery fire, while smoking cigarettes and conversing casually among themselves. The German military mind, shaped by traditions that emphasized the preservation and careful maintenance of every piece of equipment, found itself struggling to comprehend the American operational philosophy. Within the Wehrmacht, a vehicle received assignment to a specific unit, and its service life was carefully tracked and documented throughout its operational existence. The loss of a vehicle through negligence or carelessness constituted a serious offence that could result in court-martial proceedings. When mechanical problems arose, they were diagnosed with precision and attention to detail. Components were carefully repaired when possible, or manufactured locally when replacement parts were unavailable through normal supply channels. The Kübelwagen, which represented Germany's closest equivalent to the American Jeep, required mechanics with factory training to perform any significant maintenance or repair operations. The systems and components were precisely engineered and fitted, which made them excellent when functioning properly, but difficult and time-consuming to service. The Americans, by contrast, operated according to entirely different principles that reflected a fundamentally different understanding of military logistics and equipment management. They had performed calculations indicating that a Jeep's combat life expectancy was 90 days under field conditions, and they had planned their production and supply systems accordingly. Rather than investing resources in elaborate repair facilities and extensive training programs for mechanics, they simply manufactured replacement vehicles in quantities that exceeded any possible loss rate that combat operations might inflict. When a Jeep sustained damage beyond the capacity for immediate field repair, it was stripped of any usable components and then abandoned without ceremony or regret. A replacement vehicle would arrive within hours, or at most a few days, delivered by the endless convoys that maintained constant connection between the beaches and the advancing front lines. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schroeder, who served as Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, captured the German sense of bewilderment in a letter he composed to his wife back in Germany. He wrote that the Americans fought what could only be described as a rich man's war. They expended motor vehicles with the same casualness that German forces expended ammunition. He recounted witnessing a jeep strike a mine during the previous day's fighting. The crew had emerged from the vehicle unhurt, transferred their equipment and weapons to another vehicle that appeared within minutes, and then continued their assigned mission without interruption. The destroyed jeep was simply pushed to the roadside and forgotten, abandoned as though it had never existed. In the German army, he explained, such a loss would necessitate multiple reports, formal investigations, and weeks of effort through the requisition system to obtain a replacement vehicle. The contrast could not have been more stark or more demoralizing. By the 10th of June, American forces had succeeded in landing more than 12,000 vehicles on Norman soil, with jeeps comprising the single largest category within that total. These vehicles were transforming the battlefield in ways that German military doctrine had failed to anticipate or prepare for. American reconnaissance units were penetrating German defensive lines with unprecedented speed and flexibility. Artillery forward observers operating from jeeps could rapidly relocate their positions, which made counter-battery fire nearly impossible to execute effectively. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing combat forces, eliminating the traditional pauses for consolidation and reorganization that German commanders had expected to exploit for their own repositioning and counterattacks. The capabilities of the jeep itself compounded the difficulties facing German forces. With its four-wheel drive system and relatively low weight, the vehicle could traverse terrain that German planning had considered effectively impassable for motorized vehicles. The Norman Bocage country, with its characteristic sunken roads and thick hedgerows, should have channeled American vehicles into predetermined kill zones where German defences could concentrate their fire. Instead, the jeeps simply drove through open fields, over embankments, and around obstacles that would have stopped conventional vehicles. They created their own road network independent of the mapped routes that German forces had prepared to defend. The battlefield fluidity this created presented problems that German tactical doctrine had no ready answers for. Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division and who survived the war to write extensively about his experiences, reflected in his post-war writings that the jeep had given every American unit the level of mobility that German forces had achieved only with their elite mechanized formations. A single vehicle could transport a machine gun team with their weapon and ammunition, or a mortar crew with their tube and shells, or communications equipment for calling in artillery or air support, or supplies for forward units. These vehicles appeared everywhere, materializing in places the Germans thought were secure, bringing firepower or summoning artillery strikes through their radio equipment. The Germans found it impossible to establish a continuous defensive front because the Americans simply drove around static positions, bypassing them to strike deeper into the rear areas. The maintenance and supply system supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming in its scale and efficiency. American logistics units had prepared for operations on an industrial scale that matched the production scale. Ships arrived on a daily basis, carrying not just fuel and ammunition, but entire replacement vehicles, spare engines, complete transmissions, and pre-packaged component sets. Mobile workshop units advanced immediately behind combat formations, possessing the capability to perform any repair or replacement operation that might be required. If a unit suffered the loss of 10 jeeps in a day's combat, 10 replacement vehicles would arrive within 48 hours, and often considerably less than that. The supply pipeline simply absorbed losses and filled the gaps continuously. Major Heinrich Zimmermann of the 12th SS Panzer Division observed with a mixture of admiration and despair that the American supply system operated like a factory production line that had been extended all the way forward to the battlefield itself. Everything was standardized, packaged in predetermined quantities, and delivered according to established schedules. The Americans, he noted, had succeeded in removing from warfare the friction that the military theorist Clausewitz had described as the element that distinguished real war from war on paper. While German units struggled continuously to maintain their existing equipment in operational condition, the Americans simply ordered replacements as if selecting items from a commercial catalogue. The psychological implications were profound. The psychological impact on German forces became evident within the first few days following the invasion. Soldiers who had been told through propaganda that Americans were soft, dependent on material comfort, and lacking in martial spirit, discovered instead an enemy who possessed material abundance that exceeded anything in their experience or imagination. The sight of endless columns of identical jeeps, each one appearing new and fully equipped, had a profoundly demoralizing effect on troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in continuous service since the Polish campaign of 1939. The contrast between abundance and scarcity was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Gefreiter Wolfgang Braun, who worked as a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, examined captured jeeps and compiled a technical report on his findings. He noted that every component of the vehicle was designed specifically for mass production and easy replacement. The engine was simple in design, but adequate for its purpose. The transmission was robust rather than refined. Nothing was polished or precisely fitted in the German manner, yet everything functioned reliably under field conditions. The Americans, he concluded, had sacrificed elegance and refinement for quantity, and quantity was winning the war. The German emphasis on quality and craftsmanship was proving irrelevant when the enemy could field 10 adequate vehicles for every superior German vehicle. The racial integration visible in American motor pools particularly troubled German observers who had been indoctrinated in the racial theories promoted by the regime. African American soldiers drove jeeps, maintained them, and supervised motor pools with evident competence. This challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness that formed part of the ideological foundation of the regime. Feldwebel Kurt Wagner noted with obvious bewilderment in his diary that Negro soldiers operated and repaired these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. The racial theories promoted by the leadership suggested this should be impossible, yet the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound for men who had been taught that racial hierarchy was a law of nature. American modifications to their jeeps demonstrated a flexibility that German military culture could not easily accommodate. Within days of landing, units were welding additional armor plate onto their vehicles for protection against small arms fire, installing wire cutters on the front bumpers to counter German piano wire traps stretched across roads, mounting multiple machine guns for increased firepower, and adapting vehicles for specialized roles that had not been part of their original design. Medical units converted jeeps into ambulances by installing stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with radio equipment far beyond their designed capacity. Engineers mounted mine detectors on them. Each modification was crude by German engineering standards, but immediately effective in solving practical problems. The contrast with German military culture, which required formal authorization for any deviation from standard configurations, was striking. The contrast between German and American equipment became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed through June and into July. The Wehrmacht's vehicles required specific grades of fuel, specialized spare parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain, and trained mechanics who understood their complex systems. Many German units still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, with a single division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder on a daily basis. The horses were vulnerable to artillery fire and aerial attack, required constant care and veterinary attention, and limited mobility to walking pace at best. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance was deeply and increasingly demoralizing to German soldiers who walked beside their horses or rode in vehicles that broke down frequently. By the 15th of June, German intelligence estimated that American forces operating in Normandy possessed over 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving with each passing day. This number seemed literally impossible to officers who could remember the entire German army invading Poland in 1939, with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types combined. The mathematics of American production suggested something even more demoralizing. The United States could lose every single vehicle currently in Normandy and replace them all within approximately 2 weeks of production. The implications for the long-term course of the war were inescapable to anyone willing to face them honestly. Colonel Ernst Wagner of the Panzer Lehr Division compiled a comprehensive report that eventually reached Field Marshal Rommel shortly before the Field Marshal suffered his injury. Wagner wrote that German forces faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree that no one in the German command structure had imagined possible. The Americans mass-produced military vehicles using the same methods and assembly line techniques they had developed for producing civilian automobiles. Every American soldier seemed to know how to drive and perform basic maintenance on motor vehicles, reflecting the automobile culture of American civilian society. Their entire society had been mobilized for mechanical warfare in a way that German society had never achieved, despite all the regime's rhetoric about total war. The social and industrial foundation for the American war effort simply exceeded anything Germany could match. The disparity in production philosophy proved unbridgeable through any amount of effort or will. German vehicles, like the Kübelwagen, were well-engineered products, carefully constructed by skilled workers, and designed for longevity and reliable service over extended periods. But Germany's industrial system could produce only a few dozen of these vehicles per day, even at peak production rates. American Jeeps were simple, crude by German engineering standards, and designed for short service lives and easy replacement. But they rolled off assembly lines at rates Germany could not match even if all its factories were combined and dedicated solely to vehicle production. Where German industry sought perfection in each individual vehicle, American industry sought adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numbers. The different philosophies reflected different understandings of modern warfare itself. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, provided a stark assessment in his reports to higher headquarters. He wrote that German forces were fighting the previous war, while the Americans were fighting the next one. Germans worked to perfect individual vehicles, while Americans perfected the system that produced vehicles in quantity. Germans trained specialist mechanics through lengthy programs, while Americans designed vehicles that any soldier could maintain with minimal training. The Germans were artisans facing an assembly line, and the assembly line was winning through sheer productive capacity. No amount of skill or courage could overcome the material disparity. The redundancy built into the American system frustrated every attempt at German tactical planning. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineer units appeared within hours, carrying portable bridging equipment transported on jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little lasting effect when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared almost immediately to continue the mission. Mining roads and trails had minimal impact when vehicles simply drove around the obstacles or through open country. Every tactical success proved temporary and ultimately meaningless in the face of American material abundance. The Jeep transcended its function as a mere military vehicle and became instead a symbol of American abundance that troubled German soldiers at a deep psychological level. German troops reported seeing jeeps used for tasks that would have been considered completely unthinkable in the Wehrmacht, where every resource was carefully husbanded. Delivering mail to forward positions, transporting journalists and photographers, carrying chaplains to conduct religious services, even moving personal baggage for general officers. This casual use of military equipment for convenience, rather than pure necessity, demonstrated a wealth that German soldiers, accustomed to scarcity and the careful preservation of every item, found both amazing and profoundly demoralizing. It suggested an enemy for whom the material constraints of warfare simply did not apply in any meaningful way. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann wrote to his family back in Germany, describing the American approach to vehicle usage. He noted that the Americans used their vehicles the way German soldiers used bicycles, for everything and without any concern for wear or conservation. He had personally observed a jeep being used to deliver hot food to a single outpost, a trip that wore the engine and consumed fuel purely for the comfort of 3 men. In the German army, those men would have walked to collect their rations and would have eaten cold food. This apparent wastefulness should have been a weakness in military terms. But when an army could waste resources without consequence or limitation, the wastefulness itself became a form of strength. It demonstrated resources so abundant that efficiency became irrelevant. The technological gap manifested in unexpected ways that multiplied the American advantages. American jeeps came equipped with standardized toolkits that contained everything needed for common repairs, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper that any soldier could follow, and spare parts packages whose contents had been calculated through statistical analysis of failure rates. German vehicles often lacked basic tools, relied on the accumulated experience of mechanics rather than written documentation, and competed for scarce spare parts through a complex requisition system that could take weeks or months to deliver needed items. The American approach treated soldiers as interchangeable operators, while the German approach required skilled specialists. In a war of attrition, the American system proved vastly superior. As June progressed into July and the American breakout from the beachhead approached, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility and flexibility. Static defensive positions were systematically outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units that found the gaps and weak points. Artillery positions were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry before they could displace to new locations. Supply lines were cut by fast-moving patrols that appeared behind German lines, struck their targets, and disappeared before reserves could be moved to respond. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that fundamentally favoured the side possessing unlimited motorised transport. German tactical doctrine, which assumed that armies moved primarily on foot, had no answer to an enemy whose entire force structure was motorised. Major Wilhelm von Steuben, who observed American preparations for the breakout operation in late July, wrote in his diary that the Americans had achieved something that German military theorists had thought impossible. They had accomplished the complete motorization of an entire army. Every soldier could be moved by vehicle rather than marching. Every artillery piece could be towed at highway speed rather than being laboriously displaced by horses or trucks. Every supply item could be delivered directly to the consumer rather than being stockpiled at railheads. The Germans, he reflected, were fighting a 19th century war with 20th century weapons against an enemy who had achieved full 20th century warfare. The outcome was predetermined by this disparity. The German High Command's attempts to counter American motorization proved futile in practice. Orders to target vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were everywhere across the battlefield. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every unit possessed organic transportation that could operate independently of fixed supply routes. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel were negated by a supply system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany had not seen since the heady days of 1940. The fundamental problem was that German planning assumed certain universal limits on supply and production that simply did not apply to American forces. By the time Operation Cobra launched in late July, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with jeeps still comprising the single largest category within that vast fleet. The German estimate, compiled from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and aerial reconnaissance, suggested that the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses and would remain more heavily motorized than any German division operating at full authorized strength. This calculation, when it was reported through channels to Berlin, was dismissed by headquarters staff as defeatist and unrealistic. In fact, the estimate was actually conservative. The reality exceeded even these pessimistic projections. The influence of American motorization extended well beyond its immediate military impact on the battlefield. German officers who survived the war and returned to civilian life would carry these lessons forward into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production, and designed simplicity would influence German industrial development in profound ways. The Volkswagen automobile, which had failed in its military incarnation as the Kübelwagen to compete effectively with the Jeep during the war, would succeed spectacularly as the Beetle in peacetime by applying the mass production principles that the Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly on the battlefields of Europe. The lessons of defeat would shape the prosperity of peace. Feldwebel Otto Schulz, who spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in the United States and had the opportunity to observe American industrial society directly, reflected years later on what he had learned in Normandy and afterward. He wrote that in Normandy the Germans had learned that modern warfare was not fundamentally about courage, skill, or tactical brilliance, but rather about industrial capacity and productive output. The Americans had shown through their actions that victory in modern war belonged to whoever could produce the most material, ship it the fastest, and replace losses immediately and continuously. The Jeep was not just a vehicle in this context, but rather a symbol of an entirely new kind of warfare that German military tradition had not prepared anyone to fight. The age of industrial warfare had arrived, and Germany had not been ready for it. The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization on the beaches and fields of Normandy represents considerably more than a simple military mismatch or tactical disadvantage. It was fundamentally a collision between two entirely different civilizations and their respective approaches to warfare and industrial production. The Germans, with their long tradition of professional military excellence, carefully maintained equipment and emphasis on quality and craftsmanship, met head-on with an American military that had successfully transformed warfare into an exercise in industrial management and mass production. The German approach valued the individual soldier's skill and the individual weapon's quality. The American approach valued the system's productive capacity and the supply chain's reliability. Both approaches had merits, but on the battlefields of the Second World War, the American system proved overwhelmingly superior. In the final analysis, the endless columns of jeeps that poured across the Norman countryside represented something more profound and significant than military vehicles or tactical mobility. They were the physical manifestation of what Americans called the arsenal of democracy, tangible proof that American industrial might could be projected across thousands of miles of ocean and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations and planning completely obsolete. For German soldiers standing in their defensive positions, watching those columns advance day after day, each jeep served as a messenger bearing the same simple and devastating truth. The age of artisan warfare, where quality and skill mattered most, had ended permanently. The age of industrial warfare, where productive capacity determined outcomes, had begun in earnest. No amount of tactical brilliance or operational skill could overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial production that the Jeep symbolized. The last word in this accounting belongs properly to Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, who observed American operations throughout the entire Normandy campaign and survived the war to become an automotive engineer in post-war Germany. He reflected in his memoirs that the Americans had taught the Germans a fundamental lesson about the nature of modern warfare. In contemporary war, the factory was ultimately more important than the battlefield. Their jeeps, arriving in seemingly endless numbers, with each one identical and replaceable, demonstrated conclusively that warfare had evolved into a branch of industrial production. The Germans had thought of themselves as soldiers engaged in military operations. The Americans had shown them that they were actually workers in a factory of destruction, and the American factory was infinitely larger, more efficient, and more productive than anything Germany could build or sustain. That lesson would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.